Thank you very much to the moderator for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak at this important event. I think it's not really news to say that aging is one of the mega trends worldwide that impacts our societies, and it is a mega trend because it has important long-term impacts. It threatens the sustainability of pension, social security and health systems. In some countries, especially in Europe, it's also accompanied by a shrinking population in the country or in particular regions. And it has wide-ranging impact on labor supply, labor demand, trade, savings and consumption, which means that new economic patterns and realities are emerging. Now some countries, especially in Europe, are more advanced than others in addressing aging challenges and started quite early. Some of the countries in Northern Europe, for instance, Finland, was quite early in developing effective responses to aging. What I see, if we look at, let's say, the developments over the last 20 to 30 years, is that the perspective to aging in society has changed quite dramatically. In the early years, people spoke about a demographic time bomb, something that would really threaten us. In the last few years, we talk about silver economies. That's quite a shift in thinking. So in a way, part of the title of this session is crisis. I think what we probably also need to look more into is the opportunities that aging actually brings. Of course, aging means more older people, and I'm talking about maybe people over 80 or 85, but it also means that we have an aging workforce. And HR development, both as a science and as a profession, has adapted in the last years and will continue to adapt itself in response. It does so in the context also of fast-changing skill needs, changing jobs, and labor markets. Now, the aging of the workforce is quite a multidimensional problem because it has implications for working conditions, occupational health, skill development and using skills, training, and many other areas that HRD is concerned with, which makes that the responses to aging are actually quite complex and multidimensional. Today I will talk about aging in the European Union, the responses to it, and attempt to draw some general conclusions. That is not so easy because the EU member states, the 28 countries that make up the European Union, are very diverse with different economic conditions and circumstances and also different policy frameworks. But I will try to take the EU perspective and look for general patterns across countries and see what kind of lessons we can learn from that. This is an overview of the topics that I will discuss today. I'll first give you a quick insight on CEDEFOP, which is the organization I represent. And after that, I'll cover roughly 5 topics: aging and employment trends, policy responses, active aging, the challenges facing aging workers, and the lessons we can learn. I will use some empirical evidence to illustrate the main points. So, what is CEDEFOP and what do we do? Now, some of my colleagues in Greece, which is where we are based, have managed to explain everything, or let's say almost everything, in a short video of just over 2 minutes. So I'd like to show you that video so you get a quick impression of what our work is about.
The European Centre for the Development of Vocational Training, known as CEDEFOP from its French acronym, was established in 1975. It is the oldest of the 40 decentralized European Union agencies. CEDEFOP's first home was in West Berlin, West Germany. In 1995, CEDEFOP moved to Thessaloniki in Greece. CEDEFOP's 120 staff come from all over the European Union. CEDEFOP examines the relationship between skills, qualifications, and the labour market. It provides research, analysis, and labour market intelligence to improve vocational education and training, VET. CEDEFOP is involved in many initiatives to improve VET, including the New Skills Agenda for Europe. CEDEFOP monitors VET policy reform in EU member states and supports work-based learning through the European Alliance for Apprenticeships. It has helped develop European tools, such as the European Qualifications Framework and Europass, which make it easier to move across countries and different types of learning. CEDEFOP's skill supply and demand forecasts provide insights into Europe's changing labour market. The agency manages Skills Panorama, the EU central access point for information on trends for skills and jobs across Europe. CEDEFOP is also a forum for sharing ideas and debating the best ways to improve VET. CEDEFOP will continue to promote learning for work to improve European citizens' job and career prospects.
Now, as you saw in this video, learning for work is basically our motto. It's what we work on. And a lot of our work has actually in the last years focused on apprenticeships, on work-based learning, and vocational education and training policies to promote them. Also in the context of the economic crisis, we know that in many European countries, youth unemployment surged, was very high, with in some countries rates over 40%, which is dramatic. And through our work, we support those countries in improving their apprenticeship systems, allowing them to better reply to the economic crisis. But of course, learning for work is broader. It's not only, let's say, initial education, the things that people do when they're young. It's also about learning at work during their career. And in the context of population aging, we've actually worked on that since around 2000. But only a couple of years later, we started to systematically collect the evidence we have on population aging and what it actually means for the workplace. Let's say around 2008, 2010, we've tried to collect the European evidence that we have in a series, and you'll see the series on the screen, of 3 books which cover about 1,000 pages, a lot of intelligence there, about, let's say, the perspectives you can have to aging, but also what role guidance can play for aging workers. And one of the books goes more into, let's say, what are actually the benefits of investing in an older workforce. The words you see there, this word cloud, is actually the 100 most important words used in those books. And especially terms like organizational change, acting, these are some of the key words that emerge as, let's say, also HRD concepts or terms that are important, let's say, in the context of when you look at aging and work. I would like to take you through some of the most important aging and employment trends in the European Union, both looking at what has recently happened and what is expected for the next, let's say, 30 years or so. So this is a look at the most recent trends. And here we look at what happened since 2002. If you look at the population age 55 to 64, actually their share in the total population increased by about 2 percentage points, from around 11 to about 13%. Their employment rate, so how many of these people actually are employed, increased by about 15 percentage points. Now you see that the line goes up just slightly, but if you look what this means in absolute terms, it's actually quite a big shift, because the employment in millions went up from 20 million in 2002 to 35 million in 2015. This is a look at the future aging trends, and what I've done here is to compare Europe to other world regions. This is based on the UN World Population Aging Report. And what you see here is the percentage of the population age 60 or over, which is on the horizontal axis, and the number of persons aged 20 to 64 for every 65-year-old on the vertical axis. Now the developments for Europe you see in the green ellipse there in this circle. And what this shows is that compared to other world regions, Europe has actually progressed the most in terms of aging. What this means is that over the next 35 years, the share of people over 60 will increase by 10 percentage points. So while it's now around let's say 23, 24%, will be close to 35% in 2050. And while now we have 3.5 people, let's say in the age group 20 to 64, for every person aged 65 or over, this ratio will decline to 1.9 by 2050. So quite significant trends, I think. I would now like to outline some of the policy responses to aging and work in the EU in the last decades, and especially focusing on how countries have gone about dealing with aging workers in the past and how this has changed over time. Now, I think in order to understand, let's say, the developments in aging, it's good to look back a little bit. And basically, here I look, let's say, what happened since 1970. Actually, in the 1970s and 80s, the focus was very much on actually reducing the employment of aging people because of mainly economic pressures. We had the oil crisis, we had the decline of some industries, we had increasing unemployment and growing numbers of younger people entering the labor market. This led to all kinds of measures to make it easier for people to leave the labor market earlier. And this is when early and pre-retirement schemes actually came up, and also uniform pension ages were set. The idea was often that if you let aging people leave the labor market, this would make space for young people that had trouble finding a job. Actually, this argument has been proven wrong in much research, let's say in many countries around the world. It's based on the argument that you have a fixed number of jobs and that you can distribute these between either young or old people. But if you look at the international evidence, what is actually clear is that countries where you have more older people active in the labor market, these are also the countries that have more younger people active in the labor market. Now, from the 1990s onward, let's say more or less, it differs a bit depending on what country you look at. We see that the response to aging and work changes quite significantly. Here we see demographic pressures. Countries started to feel the rising cost of pensions, also in some cases emerging labor market and skill shortages. And also the fact that aging became recognized as a let's say, a future threat. This is also the times when the demographic time bomb idea came up that I mentioned earlier. This led to pension reform in many countries, also better anti-discrimination legislation. So it became, let's say, there were legal innovations to make sure that age discrimination was prevented. New lifelong learning and employment incentives, and measures to, let's say, change the attitudes, the perceptions of age in society. Now, when I was preparing for this presentation, I tried to look at what this actually means. Let's say these policy measures over different time periods. What does that mean in terms of employment rates? And it was actually very hard or virtually impossible to find evidence for the EU as a whole, because the EU now has many more countries than it used to have in the 70s. We have problems with definitions and things like that, so I won't go into detail there. But I did manage to find a more or less consistent, let's say, data or time series for my home country, the Netherlands. And this is where we look at, let's say, the developments, let's say, from 1970 onwards. Now, I actually found it quite surprising to see that in 1970, which is now 45 years ago, actually 80% of men were employed. That's more than it is today. You see that employment rate is declining over the years quite significantly. And in 1994, which is the year where the employment rate for men was the lowest, it was only 38%. So you see that the employment rate of aging workers, let's say, was cut in half. This is what is also sometimes called the age employment paradox, because in the same period we see life expectancy increasing and employment rates go down. In the Netherlands, many people ended up in disability schemes. Access to these schemes became easier over the years, and this led to that in 1990 over 14% of the labor force was in these disability schemes, where it was like 5% in 1970. In 2014, the employment rate for men was back up to 67%. Not yet back to where we started. Now, for women, the pattern is a bit different. Starting at around 32% of women, let's say older women, that were employed in 1970. In 1985, this dropped to a little over 10%. And the latest data, which we show here, which is 2014, it was 43%. So this has increased quite significantly. We have to keep in mind that in the Netherlands, in that specific contract, many women work part-time. So this doesn't mean that, let's say, every person that is employed also has a full-time job. Now, from 2000 roughly onwards, in Europe and in many other countries around the world, we see a trend towards seeing aging more holistically. And this is also the time when active aging comes up as a framework for policies in many countries. You see examples of this, let's say, in the overall EU policy development, but also in active aging strategies in member states. The pioneering work on active aging was done by the World Health Organization in the late 1990s. And it produced a very important report, which is called Active Aging, a Policy Framework, around 2002. Now, active aging has three, let's say, legs. It's about participation, health, and security. Now, important is to point out that participation doesn't only mean labor market participation. It's actually much broader. It looks at, let's say, social participation, participation in cultural activities, and a whole range of, let's say, activities that people can be involved in. The roots of active aging are actually much older. It was a concept that already existed in the 1940s. But in those days it was, let's say, more about promoting aging people to be active for personal life satisfaction, while the more recent meaning of the active aging development is much broader. I also try to see, let's see if we can see some trends of how important active aging has become. And just to get a general impression, I used Google Scholar and I looked at, let's say, publications and reports and academic research and see how much active aging actually comes up. And here you can see that actually it's quite a significant development. The picture is quite clear. While in the early 1990s, there were just a few publications that looked at active aging. In the last 5 years, this has risen to 16,000. Now, most publications on active aging actually look at health issues, but there are also a number of them that look, let's say, at employment or HRD. Now, I'd like to move from, let's say, the concept or let's say, how this active aging concept emerged to what is actually happening in the European Union to make active aging a reality. And I think legislation and funding instruments are some of the foundations. I'll come to more concrete policy measures later. There's a number of EU-wide legislation, let's say laws, which are kind of blanket laws that cover all the countries, that support active aging in the European Union, and I'll just mention a couple of them. For instance, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which includes, let's say, the provisions on age discrimination, but also more general provisions in treaties that promote employment and social inclusion, objectives of promoting the working environment to protect worker safety and health. Also, which is very important for CEDEFOP, is Article 166 of the Treaty of the EU, which is on vocational training and labor market integration. And then you also have directives that are kind of instruments to make sure that, that countries have legislation in place to ensure that the capacity of workers is taken into account when planning or organizing work, and safety and health at work regulations. Now, many of these EU legislation principles also informed the development of active aging strategies at national level. Let me turn to funding activities. It's quite important, and I just mentioned a couple of the main funding instruments that exist at European level. The European Structural Investment Funds, you might have heard of an important fund that is part of that, the European Social Fund, which actually finances or co-funds a lot of activities that promote active aging, for instance, by funding training for aging workers. I'd also like to mention the Horizon 2020 initiative, which is, let's say, looking in or promoting innovation in the countries to deal with challenges. And for active aging, the theme that's very important is health, demographic change, and well-being. Some other programs are, for instance, the Employment and Social Innovation Program and the Health Program, but these are smaller. I'll take you through a couple of the most important EU active aging policies and strategies since 2000 on the way to 2020. 2020 has been, let's say, the horizon in the last years where much of the policies was focused on. There's also a number of targets that the EU set to be achieved by 2020. What is important, there was actually a quite important initiative, was the Lisbon strategy, the 2000 Lisbon strategy, which included an employment target for the population, and shortly after also included an employment target for aging workers to be 50%. Some years later, in 2006, we had a quite important report on the demographic future of Europe, from challenges to opportunities. And this report looked at how you can create more jobs, how you can increase working lives of better quality, and how you can make public finances and pension systems sustainable. Actually, in 2010, there are a couple of initiatives, European Council conclusions on active aging, which gave countries a number of priorities to work on, actually 19. Also the Europe 2020 strategy, which set a 75% employment target and had a number of what we call flagship initiatives. Some of the important flagship initiatives are new skills for new jobs. Let's say a general framework helping countries to meet labor market and skill needs and to step up investment in education and training. But also the innovation partnerships on active and healthy aging. In 2011, the Health for Growth program followed up by a framework for occupational safety and health in 2014. And what is also important to mention, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, is the 2012 European Year for Active Aging and Solidarity Between Generations. The most recent initiatives which is very relevant to aging is the New Skills Agenda for Europe, which was adopted this year. Very relevant to an aging society because it improves the quality and the relevance of skills formation and also tries to make skills more visible and comparable. This will help people develop more over their careers and also will promote that, let's say, the actual skills that people have are better used. I said I would come back quickly to the European Year, and just as a bit of background, these European years have existed since 1983, and they always encourage debate and dialogue within and between countries. They are, so to say, awareness-raising campaigns to educate European citizens, attract the attention of national governments to a particular issue, to change attitudes and behaviors. And also they have the aim to influence policies. Now every year there's a particular theme, and in 2012 it was on active aging. Now what I present here is based on the evaluation of this European year, And it shows what kind of impact it has in a nutshell. First of all, the year was a year to develop new policies and tools. Guiding principles for active aging in terms of employment, participation, and independent living, but also trying to measure active aging, to monitor it in the countries, to see what is actually happening. Also, a number of countries started adopting new strategies for active aging. Now, these new policies, these new tools, they were combined with strengthening the stakeholder involvement in 3 different ways. Increased awareness, more debate, and mutual learning between countries. And here you could see that this is involving many different stakeholders in the countries: employer organizations, trade unions, civil society, regions, which are important players as well, and the media. Now, on the right, you see what we could see more or less as policy impact. And we see that in close to half of the countries, you see that stakeholders in the countries say that the year itself led to new initiatives, or it led to getting priorities or increasing priorities of active aging in the country, new target groups of policies. And in some countries it also stimulated cross-border cooperation. So countries started to work together to look at the common problems they had, to find, let's say, ways to cooperate, to see where they could move forward, to learn from each other. So I think the year on active aging, setting it very clearly on the agenda, did make a difference, because it helped put aging as an important issue on policy agendas. Now, what can we say about active aging in the countries that make up the EU? As I said in the previous slide, one of the achievements of the European year was development of monitoring, of actually seeing what is going on into the countries. And the Active Aging Index is an instrument to see what countries are doing, in what state they're in terms of active aging. And what it actually does is combining information on employment, participation in society, independent and secure living, and the capacity for active aging. A lot of statistical indicators go into this monitoring framework, and some of the outcomes are here. These are the data for 2014. Now, quite important differences between the countries. You see, for instance, a score of almost 45 in Sweden versus less than 30 in Greece. Northern EU countries tend to score better. In the middle, you see kind of medium scores, and in the Eastern EU countries, the scores are somewhat lower. Now, part of the work on the Active Aging Index also looked at correlations. Can we see what kind of impact this active aging has? And it suggests that active aging is beneficial for people and for the economy, because countries where the active aging index is higher, in those countries, life satisfaction among older people is higher, and also GDP is higher. Can we say something about, let's say, progress over the last couple of years? We can see from this analysis that there has been some progress, but not on all of these 4 issues that go in. In terms of employment, the progress has not been that much, mainly because of the crisis. Participation in society, we've seen some more programs, but over a period of 4 years, we see small shifts. I think it's also important to point out that even in countries that do quite well in terms of active aging, there's still considerable room for improvement. The highest country now has a score of 45, while the maximum, let's say, if you have the perfect aging society, it would be somewhere around 57. Where you need the improvement also differs between countries. Some countries need to focus more on employment issues, others need to focus on others. What to say, I mean, statistics have their limits, and okay, they only give a general impression, but this active aging index is a good example of how to use statistics, how to make them come to life for policymakers in designing or changing their active aging policies. It gives, and especially if you look at underlying dimensions, it gives policymakers insights on what to work on. Now, from an HRD perspective, it is of course crucial to know what challenges aging workers face when it comes to learning and development, employment. I will not talk about all those challenges, they are quite well known, but I'll try to focus on 3 that come from research that we've done over the last few years. I'll try to illustrate a bit what we found with some facts. The first one is about skills outdating. How fast do skills become out of date? Now, of course, we know that skills becoming out of date is a fact of life. What I also think is that it's quite difficult to quantify, mainly because it's very hard to disentangle actually, the part, let's say, the actual outdating of the skills and what people learn. Because if you try to measure skills that people have, it's always a combination of many different factors. We tried to get an idea of how much skills outdating takes place in a small pilot survey that we did a couple of years ago by directly asking adult workers in 4 EU member states. And we asked them what part of the skills they developed anywhere. And anywhere could be in school, it could be in work, it could be somewhere else. They now consider outdated. Now, the picture is that if you look at 100 people, 29 actually says, none of my skills have become out of date. 11 say that more than half of the skills have become out of date. 23 say it's between a quarter and a half, and the rest considers that up to a quarter of their skills they have developed over time became outdated. Now, it's not necessarily a problem because skills outdating is also a sign of dynamic jobs that help people actually learn. If you have enough workplace training, but maybe even more important, a learning environment that is conducive to learning, ensuring that people can update their skills, this is not necessarily a problem. I would say that people that say that there have been none of their skills became outdated are probably people that face particular challenges, because they are not, let's say, in a job that challenges them to develop over time. They're also more at risk. If something happens, if the company moves abroad, then they have very little, let's say, development over time that they can use to move somewhere else. Well, these people also face challenges. Then, of course, people that face a lot of skills outdating, that don't get enough investment in skills, might also face employability problems. The next slide comes from a survey that we've held in all the EU member states in 2014, which we call the European Skills and Jobs Survey. Now, here we look for different generations at, let's say, particular skills issues, and we look at undereducation and skill gaps for workers of different ages. Undereducation is when someone has a qualification, an education level that is lower than they actually need for their job. Skill gaps is when people miss or say that they miss some important skills. Now, what is interesting to see is that while skill gaps, they appear to be less common among older workers, undereducation is much more of an issue for them. And here you see that 20%, 1 out of 5 workers in the EU have the skills, but they don't have the education to show for it. They don't have the qualification to show for it. That makes it very important that next to training, we also look at skills validation, that people actually have a way to prove their skills. It's a very important element in active aging strategies. I would also like to show you some evidence from Italy, where we have some interesting data because Italian colleagues did a survey among older workers. And what this actually did was comparing the benefits of training with motivations. So they asked people before they actually took part in training, what is your motivation to take part in training for different things? I mean, wage increases, ensuring that I keep my job, mobility. And what you see is that for all of these possible benefits of training, there's a large gap between what people see as a motivation to take part and what they actually see after they took the training, which means that workers do not always see the benefits. I think there's also an important role, especially for particular groups of workers, to ensure that they're motivated. Lessons to be learned. I think potentially there are many, but I would say that the EU experience that we've, let's say, seen over the last decades points to 3 main lessons in terms of policy development. First of all, the importance of putting aging on the agenda, especially the European year, but also the attention at EU level over the years has managed to put stakeholders involved and has had some policy impact. Doesn't mean that implementation is where we would like it to be yet. Also, the value of a policy framework and monitoring progress at country level. I think this could also be mirrored at lower levels, for instance, at industries level or at company level. Monitoring progress, demographic literacy tools for small and medium-sized enterprises, sectoral skills initiatives, they would show their value at other levels. I think also the EU experience showed the value of learning from each other. Countries have managed in all kinds of form to exchange experiences, to also avoid making the same mistakes again. Sometimes policy answers seem simple, but there are traps. I remember an example from my own country, if you have a training subsidy for older workers, what might happen if you put a particular age, you can say people over 40 get a training subsidy. What actually happened is that people that were just under 40 didn't get training, they just got the training a few years later. So it's not always so clear that what you have in mind works out. I would also like you just to show some overall statistical evidence which shows patterns across the EU, which also point towards some important lessons for human resource development. The first one is that lifelong learning societies tend to be also more age inclusive. What we see here is that countries where there's a lot of lifelong learning participation, those are also the countries where the differences between aging workers and younger workers are much smaller. Aging workers tend to participate more there. This is a bit older evidence, but I think it's also good in showing, because this shows that the barriers to take part in learning are actually less important for older workers compared to their younger colleagues. Only health or age-related barriers are more important for older workers, but issues like conflict with work schedule or cost tend to be actually less important for older workers than it is for younger workers. This is about skills policies in general in the member states. And here we looked at validation, making sure people can show for their skills, guidance, recognition of qualifications in an index, and we looked at how that impacts on activation. And activation means employment and labor market transitions. What you see is that countries that have invested a lot in strengthening their skill systems, their validation, their guidance, and practices, they have higher levels of labor market activation. This is the last statistical evidence, so I'm almost there. I think this one is also important to show. If you look at the perceptions of age in society, the way people see age, and you compare that to innovation performance, you see actually quite a correlation there. And of course, this is only a correlation. We have to be careful in drawing too much conclusions. But what it does show is that part of innovative societies is their ability to value people of all ages. Now, aging and HRD, where do we go from here? This is, of course, a very difficult question. And I was thinking about what things would be good to focus on. And I think, just if you think in very broad terms, not going into all kinds of policies, measures, instruments, I think more or less the principles we have in mind, the way we think, is probably the most important policy idea. Of course, it's important to create and to keep doing that, create the possibilities and the conditions for age-aware HRD. Strategies, incentives, age-friendly workplaces, making sure that there are no negative perception of age, these are all very important. Actually, the latest evidence that is just about to be published by one of our sister agencies shows that although countries have moved forward, only in 10 of the EU countries we see truly an integrated, holistic approach to aging. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Now, the next phase, I would say that it's about seeing aging truly as a strategic resource. I mentioned already looking at the skills people have, validating it, but also using it in jobs is important. Matching jobs to people instead of matching people to jobs. Also, an idea that could help and move things forward. More strategic partnerships, seeing HR as a profession, as a practice, and as a science, more as a strategic partner with governments, for instance. I think the main idea is that it's not about what we should be doing for aging workers, but what aging workers can contribute to society. This is the
고령 근로자가 지금 늘고 있는 그런 상황인데, 지금 4차 산업을 대변하는 그런 그 빠른 기술 혁신이 오는 이런 상황에서 과연 고령 근로자가 직업 현장에서 성과를 낼 수 있을 것인지, 그러면 또 어떻게 낼 수 있도록 하려면 어떤 교육을 기업이나 교육이나 혹은 대학에서 혹은 정부가 준비를 할 수 있다고 보는지, 아마 이 부분은 반루 박사께서 해주시면 좋을 것 같고요.
To the questions on the audience, with all these changes, how do we ensure, I think that's what I understand from the question, how do we ensure that aging workers perform well in the workplace? Okay, training is of course important, but I think more and more we realize that we also need to think the other way around. We need to look at the skills that people have, because if you look, and I'm just from the top of my head, some of the evidence of our work shows that actually 30% of the jobs in Europe are not using the potential of people. So there are underused skills. Training is vital, but we also need to see where can people contribute. And so in some cases you might need not to adapt the person, but you might need to adapt the job. Two other points on that. I think intergenerational learning is a very important, let's say, mechanism to support aging. And I'm not only thinking about, let's say, the young workers teaching the old, but this also goes the other way around. Older workers have different kind of skills, they have more experience, so they can also help younger workers. Already a long time ago there was discussion and research on how to make teams, work teams, age optimal. So having a good distribution of different ages and making sure that you benefit from all ages in the companies. Actually, career management skills are one of the key skills of the 21st century. Already mentioned earlier, people will not stay in the same job, so it's important you know how to navigate your career. There also training plays a role, but also, let's say, the way you design jobs, the way you design progression. But at the individual level, for workers, making sure that they have qualifications, because many people have skills, but they don't have the qualifications to show for them. That's one of the main issues of older workers. In Europe that's the case, and I'm sure that's also the case elsewhere. They have built up the skills by long experience over time, and they probably will do fine when they stay in their job, but they're limited in terms of progressing, because they don't have, let's say, the paper to show to a next employer that they actually have the skills. So there's where validation comes in as an important issue. Career exploration is important, and one of the key employability skills. I think to make sure that people have it over a lifetime, it's important to start early on. So already early on, make sure that people have exposure to business, for instance, get opportunities to develop entrepreneurship, not only in terms of setting up a company, but also developing yourself. So that's also one of the EU priorities for vocational education and training, to make sure that people have these skills and have this sense of entrepreneurship, or what we also sometimes call intrapreneurship, which is entrepreneuring yourself.
저희보다 먼저 고령화를 거쳐간 EU의 그 고령화에 대한 그런 도전이 어떻게 극복을 하였는가라는 부분에 대한 발표 너무 감사드리고요. 이렇게 또 장시간 앉아서 경청해 주신 그 오디언스에게도 감사드립니다. 이것으로 이번 세션을 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.